Welcome to 5 Good Minutes.
You're listening to today's inspirational message on the book of Esther
with Brady Randall.
Today we're starting with Esther chapter 5, but in this first section today, I want to highlight the gap between chapters 4 and 5. So far in this podcast study of Esther, we've gotten to see the gracious, sovereign hand of God looking out for his people, the Jews. And at the end of chapter 4, we read this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. And then picking up in verse 1 of chapter 5, we read this. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. And I'm struck by the gap between these two chapters. Esther has made a conscious decision to intentionally seek God by fasting, seeking his heart and his favor and his counsel and direction. She's waiting on God, unsure of what or how he will respond, and then she gets up. And as we start this chapter, I just want to hone in on this idea of actively and patiently waiting on God. Waiting on God can be really, really hard and really painful because God rarely, if ever, works on our timeline. If I'm speaking honestly myself, I want things to happen yesterday. And this is especially hard for us fix-it types. We want to know what we can do to make it happen, and have to sit back is extremely difficult. I don't want to wait quietly on the Lord when things happen outside of my control, like when my flight is delayed, or when I'm caught in traffic, or when I can't go to the doctor, or when things are canceled and don't go my way. I'd rather grumble and complain, and yet here Esther shows the value in waiting quietly and actively on the Lord. She waited with hope and purpose. She waited on God. She sought his ways, his heart. She left everything up to God. But she didn't just sit back on her hands and feet. She got up. She put on her royal robes. She stood in the inner court of that palace, getting ready to go into the presence of the king, not knowing what could happen. And remember that famous line she shared at the end of chapter 4? She said, if I perish, I perish. But God was very much at work, and he was getting ready to yet use Esther in a very powerful way in his plans and his timeline. And she waited, and she arose. You see, much of the Christian life is about waiting on a God who has his own perfect timeline. But I want to encourage you that the waiting is not wasted. God is doing something powerful that maybe you do not yet see. Waiting often involves pain and discomfort, but it's not in vain. In fact, we're reminded in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verses 16 and 17. The Apostle Paul writes this. He says, therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal weight of glory that far outweighs them all. Think of how the disciples had to wait on God after he was crucified. After Jesus Christ, his son, was crucified, they lost their best friend. He was killed in a brutal, humiliating manner. He was hung on a cross, and then he was buried in a tomb. And it seemed like all hope was lost. The disciples were beside themselves. Where was God? What was he doing? But God was working while they were waiting. As Jesus lay in the tomb, especially that silent Saturday, God was preparing for them, for us, for the world, the most glorious event in world history, when he would raise Jesus on the third day, defeating sin, death, and hell. For the world and the disciples, the waiting was worth it. And so I want you to ask yourself, what are you waiting on God for right now? Maybe for some, you're waiting to decide if God is real, if he's going to show up at all. I want to encourage you, keep waiting, and while you wait, keep seeking. And the promise is that for those who genuinely seek, they will genuinely find. Maybe you're waiting on God right now for a healing. for financial provision, for a loved one to come to Christ, for a marriage to heal. Maybe you've prayed and you're ready to give up. Can I encourage you today? Don't give up hope in God. He might be doing a million things in the background that we cannot yet see, and He promises it will be worth it in the end. And as you wait, arise with hope in God as Esther did as she entered the presence of the king. Our God may feel slow at times, but He's never late, and He will never ultimately forsake you if you and I turn to Him today.
Thanks for joining us here today. There's a lot of great content to explore on Orchard Hill Plus and on the Orchard Hill main feed from the weekend. Have a great day.